How does a simple talk show appearance spiral into a full-blown war of egos on national television? What could provoke a legendary actor like Sylvester Stallone to shift from quiet charm to cutting defiance in a matter of minutes? And more importantly, what made Jimmy Kimmel lose control of his own stage? The evening began as any other. The polished lights of Jimmy Kimmel's studio danced across the polished stage, the audience brimming with anticipation. The camera panned to Jimmy, whose usual brand of sarcastic wit made the crowd chuckle. But there was an edge to him tonight, a tension under the surface that only those paying close attention could sense. Perhaps it was fatigue, or perhaps it was something more intentional. Sylvester Stallone arrived to roaring applause. The room lit up, and for good reason. The man was a living icon, a testament to grit and resilience. But even legends are not immune to disrespect, especially when it creeps in under the veil of comedy. Jimmy welcomed him with the familiar warmth, but almost immediately the questions turned pointed. It started subtly. A backhanded compliment here, a jab at Stallone's age there. Comments that would normally be brushed off, yet tonight they hit differently. Perhaps it was the choice of words, or the way Jimmy lingered on certain phrases. He pressed Stallone about his latest project, a small independent film that the actor had poured his heart into. Jimmy mocked its budget, joking about it being more of a vanity project than a real movie. The laughter from the audience followed, not because the joke landed, but because the cue cards told them to. Why did Jimmy seem determined to undermine Stallone's credibility? Was it jealousy masked as humor, or a calculated attempt to make headlines with a controversial segment? Sylvester's expression shifted almost imperceptibly at first, but as the interview progressed, the change became undeniable. Jimmy pivoted to Stallone's early career, dragging up old rumors, suggesting the actor had exaggerated his struggles before fame. He framed it as curiosity, but his tone was biting. He accused Stallone of leaning too heavily into his underdog narrative, almost as if his legacy was a carefully constructed myth. Was Jimmy trying to reframe the Stallone story altogether? Was he aiming to reduce decades of work, passion, and personal battles into nothing more than marketing tactics? The audience grew tense. Laughter became scattered, uncertain. Stallone sat still, his face unreadable for a moment, his silence louder than any outburst could have been. The air felt heavier with each passing second. And then, finally, Stallone leaned forward. The actor, long respected for his restraint, his grace under pressure, began to unravel the mask. With an unnerving calm, he addressed the tone of the interview, not with anger, but with the measured intensity of a man who had endured worse and emerged stronger. What followed wasn't a tantrum, nor a celebrity meltdown. It was something far more powerful: accountability. He called out the double standard in the room, the way older actors were mocked while being expected to remain stoic and composed. He pointed to the hypocrisy of a media landscape that applauds resilience only when it serves a narrative, but mocks it when it challenges the host's control. And just like that, the dynamic shifted. The applause didn't return, not yet. Instead, the studio sat in stunned silence, watching as the very foundation of late-night decorum cracked under the weight of Stallone's quiet fury. Jimmy, caught off guard, fumbled to recover. He tried to laugh it off, but Stallone wasn't smiling anymore. What happens when a beloved guest refuses to play along? What do you do when the punchline punches back? Jimmy Kimmel, known for his quick tongue and ability to diffuse awkwardness with humor, suddenly found himself in unfamiliar territory. The studio lights hadn't changed, but the atmosphere had. It was no longer entertainment. It was exposure. Sylvester Stallone had dismantled the veneer of comedy and revealed something far more uncomfortable: the quiet cruelty that often hides behind a host's smirk. The crowd, unsure how to react, fell into a tense quiet. It was the kind of silence that dared not move. Jimmy tried regaining control with a joke, something about old men getting too sentimental on camera, but the moment had already slipped from his hands. Stallone didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, unbothered, confident. Not arrogant, but deeply grounded, like someone who had already won the fight before it began. What Jimmy failed to realize was that he had invited a fighter into his ring and expected him to shadowbox. But Stallone had spent his entire life proving people wrong. From critics who said he'd never make it past his first script, to producers who said his face wasn't marketable. Jimmy's dismissive tone had awoken something that didn't need defending, because it had already survived. The conversation moved forward but with a jagged rhythm. Jimmy shifted topics clumsily, asking about Stallone's family life, perhaps hoping to soften the mood. But again, his phrasing leaned too far into mockery. He alluded to Stallone's children using their father's fame for attention. It was a cheap shot, low-hanging fruit, and the audience didn't laugh. A few even gasped. The joke hadn't landed. It had collapsed. Stallone's response was subtle but surgical. He spoke of what it meant to be a father in the spotlight, the pressure it places on children, and the struggle to raise decent human beings while cameras followed your every move. There was no bragging, no defensiveness, just a quiet confrontation with the reality Jimmy had tried to reduce to a punchline. And then came the moment no one could have predicted. Stallone turned the lens back on Jimmy himself, not with insults or accusations, but with pointed reflection. He asked why late-night television had become a platform for tearing down instead of lifting up. Why was sincerity now treated like a weakness? Why did vulnerability get packaged as entertainment for others to mock? Jimmy was cornered not by aggression but by truth. His smile faltered. His eyes scanned the crew, then the audience, searching for an anchor. But he found none. Because in that moment, everyone in the room could see what was happening. The power had shifted, and not through theatrics, but through dignity. The comment section online began to explode even before the segment ended. Clips of Stallone's monologue spread across social media like wildfire. Viewers from all sides of the cultural divide were weighing in, many of them praising the actor for standing his ground. The irony was thick. Jimmy, who had built his career on exposing others, was now being dissected himself. As the cameras kept rolling, Jimmy tried steering the conversation toward safer territory. But it was too late. The performance had been broken, the script tossed aside. What remained was real, raw, and unfiltered. Stallone didn't come for a fight, but when one was forced on him, he didn't flinch. And still, he hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted. That was what made it so devastating. Jimmy had underestimated the quiet kind of strength, the kind that didn't need an audience to prove itself, the kind that made people remember not what was said, but how it made them feel. By the end of the segment, Jimmy looked tired. Not physically, but hollow. The control he usually maintained over his show had slipped, and no amount of ad breaks or clever transitions could mask that. The applause sign lit up again, but this time, the claps felt scattered, forced, because the audience knew they had witnessed something they weren't supposed to. A reversal, a reckoning, and just when it seemed like Stallone had made his point and would ease off, something deeper rose to the surface. Something more personal. Not about ego or reputation, but about dignity. It was supposed to be a light-hearted visit, a routine interview capped with applause and a few chuckles. But what had begun as another segment in Jimmy Kimmel's endless lineup of celebrity banter had become something altogether different. A confrontation not just between two men, but between two ideals. Sylvester Stallone wasn't done. He had peeled back the first layer of mockery, but now he began uncovering something deeper. Not just personal slights or cheap laughs, but the growing cultural problem of media arrogance. He brought the conversation to a place far more uncomfortable than anyone had anticipated, including Jimmy. He spoke about how modern television had forgotten what respect looked like. He pointed out the way hosts, in their pursuit of viral moments, had started treating guests not as people, but as props. He didn't name other shows. He didn't need to. He stayed focused on the room they were in. And that was what made it hit so hard. It wasn't vague criticism. It was a mirror. And Jimmy was standing in front of it. Jimmy attempted to interrupt, to retake the reins, but it was useless. Every time he tried steering the conversation back toward humor, it only revealed his desperation. There was a visible flicker of panic in his posture. He tried to laugh, but the sound didn't carry. He tried to joke, but no one followed. The rhythm was gone. The control was gone. Stallone had taken the spotlight, and not through force, but through conviction. Then came the comment that broke the room. Not loud, not sharp, but honest. Stallone reflected on a moment from his past when he was publicly humiliated early in his career by a talk show host who had thought it funny to mock his slurred speech. That moment had stayed with him for decades. He had laughed along at the time just to survive it. But it had hardened something inside him. He had carried it quietly, a wound that never fully closed. Now, years later, here he was, once again in the hot seat of late-night banter, facing a more polished version of the same game. But this time, he wasn't playing along. Jimmy didn't know how to respond. Any attempt to lighten the mood would now come across as dismissal of pain. Any apology would seem performative. He had backed himself into a corner, and the audience knew it. The cameras were still rolling, but the energy in the room had shifted entirely. This wasn't a moment people would laugh about the next day. This was a reckoning that would follow him. Stallone didn't gloat. He didn't press further. Instead, he turned to the audience and thanked them for listening, for sitting with discomfort, and for understanding that not every confrontation is about anger. Sometimes it is about reclaiming something long denied. Dignity in the face of public spectacle. The crowd erupted, but not with the same cheer that had welcomed Stallone earlier. This time, the applause came from a place of respect. Not just for the man, but for the message. It was rare, almost sacred in its silence, and then its sudden burst. It filled the studio with something that had been missing for far too long. Authenticity. Jimmy sat still, no longer attempting to charm his way out of the situation. For once he didn't have the last word. He watched as Stallone nodded respectfully to the crew, shook a few hands, and exited the stage. Not defeated, but elevated. In the control room, producers scrambled, whispering about how to edit the segment, whether to air it as it was, or to cut it down into more manageable, less controversial clips. But it was too late. The internet had already caught fire. Cell phone footage, backstage whispers, and live tweets had painted the picture. In real time, the raw version was out there, and there was no undoing it. The moment would live on, not because it was shocking, but because it was true. Because one man chose not to sit quietly while being packaged into a joke. Because, sometimes, dignity roars without ever raising its voice. The show ended without its usual flourish. No wide smile from the host, no final gag to send the audience off laughing into the night. Instead, Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk looking smaller than usual, as if the weight of what had just unfolded had finally settled onto his shoulders. His usual certainty, the armor of wit he wore so comfortably, had been cracked. And the silence that followed was deafening. Backstage, Stallone remained composed. There was no celebration, no victory lap, just a quiet retreat into the hallway, his team respectfully silent as they followed his lead. He had said what needed to be said. There was nothing else to add. This wasn't about pride, it was about truth. Online, the response came fast. Viewers flooded social media with reactions, most of them supporting Stallone's decision to stand up for himself and call out the deeper problem hiding in plain sight. Memes and commentary circulated within minutes. But unlike the usual internet, chaos. This time the tone was different. It wasn't just mockery or fandom, it was reflection. People were beginning to question the way talk shows operated, how entertainment had turned personal histories and traumas into punchlines for late-night consumption. Clips of Stallone's calm but devastating monologue went viral. Every major outlet replayed the exchange, but it was the raw, uncut version that people gravitated toward. No edits, no filters, just the truth. It felt like something long overdue had finally been said on a platform that so rarely allowed anything real to surface. Meanwhile, Jimmy's team was in crisis mode. Publicists scrambled to draft statements, and PR managers debated whether he should issue a formal apology. But Jimmy, for the first time in a long time, didn't have a snappy comeback. He had misread the moment. He had poked too hard, thinking it was just another harmless bit, and it had backfired. The next night, when Jimmy returned to his desk, there was no attempt to ignore what had happened. He opened his monologue with a different kind of expression, not his usual smirk, but a more subdued tone. He acknowledged the previous night's show, admitted that the segment had not gone the way he expected, and for a brief moment seemed to grasp the reality of the message that had been delivered in front of millions. But it wasn't Jimmy's response that would be remembered. It was Stallone's restraint, his clarity, his decision not to humiliate, but to challenge. He didn't need to yell or insult. He simply reflected the truth back at the source, and the truth did all the work. Industry insiders began whispering about a turning point. Other celebrities who had quietly endured similar moments were now speaking up. The era of passive acceptance had been shaken. People were re-evaluating what they expected from their entertainers and their interviewers. The audience had grown, tired of watching vulnerability get twisted into amusement. And for Stallone, it marked something even more powerful. He had nothing left to prove in his career. He had the accolades, the legacy, the history. But what he delivered on that stage wasn't about films or awards. It was about principle, about refusing to let legacy be repackaged as spectacle, about choosing dignity, even when the world expected silence. The incident didn't ruin Jimmy Kimmel's career, but it reshaped his show. Future interviews took on a more cautious tone. Producers became more mindful, jokes less barbed, conversations more thoughtful. It was as if Stallone had reminded everyone, guests are not props. They are people. And some of them, when pushed, will push back with more grace and force than anyone expects. In the end, the moment became legendary not because it embarrassed a host, but because it elevated a truth. In an industry so often built on pretense, Stallone had reminded the world that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply speaks, and everyone listens. And for those who watched, it wasn't just another viral clip. It was a lesson in self-respect, a moment of triumph, a reminder that even in a world obsessed with laughs, there is something more powerful than a punchline: integrity.